Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel of the hour, Communicating Environmental Ethics to Make a Difference. My name is Kennedy Tamashiro, and I am a Rural Roads Communications undergrad student, and I have the pleasure of hosting and introducing this wonderful session today. I would first like to acknowledge that Rural Roads University is on the lands of the Quisepsum, Esquimalt, and Lekwungen Songhees ancestors and families. I would also like to acknowledge that today I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Waikiki Nakota Nations, and the Métis Nations of Region 3, and all the people who make their homes in the treaty regions of Southern Alberta. With gratitude, we live, work, and learn on these lands here, and where the past, present, and future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people can come together. So today's panel explores the meaning of sustainability in terms of ethics and features for Rural Roads panelists. First, we have Dr. Pedro Márquez, who is the Vice President of Research and International. Dr. Gio Takash, who is an associate professor in the School of Communication and Culture and the head of the blended bachelor's program in professional communications. Dr. Runa Das, who is an associate professor at the School of Environment and Sustainability. And last but not least, Lynn Couvé, who is a student in the Master's in Environmental Education and Communication program. So in keeping with our panelists' view that solutions to our urgent and complex environmental challenges require approaches that we've tried in the past, we're going to proceed a little bit differently in this session than in some other panels. Each of our panelists will begin with a short opening statement. They'll then engage in an unscripted conversation with one another. They'll respond to what they have heard from each other, and they'll address some questions that they have agreed upon in advance around our topic of how we communicate environmental ethics to make a difference. That was a mouthful, but regardless, thank you everyone for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the session. I believe I'm passing it off to Gio or Pedro. Yeah, thanks.
I think we'll start with Lynn, actually.
That works too. That's even better. Thanks.
Nakumik Kennedy, can you hear me? Awesome. Thank you, Glenora, for unmuting me. So I am also joining from Treaty 7 area. So Kennedy, we are in the same traditional region. I would like to do my opening statement as a very short story that I'm hoping will orient you to my understanding of environmental ethics. Quickly to credit the story, it was originally recorded by Knud Rasmussen, who is a famous Danish explorer from the earliest 20th century who was partly Nook himself, and it was translated by W. Worcester. The original author is marked as unknown, but we know that it was an Inuk from Greenland. So the story is called Anartik. So once there was an old man with many daughters and one son named Anartik. Anartik and his sisters would go hunting to fill their umiak with meat. His sisters would force the reindeer down the fjord to the water and Anartik would kill them. And one time, Anartik saw a baby reindeer in the water and he decided to play with it. However, the reindeer fought him and flipped over Anartik's kayak. Anartik's sisters could hear him saying in the water, "Now the salmon are beginning to eat my belly." Anartik woke up under the water as a salmon. The old man, the father, was sad for years and he couldn't go back to those family hunting grounds, except for this one time he decided to go with his daughters. And as they were paddling into the area where Anartik went under, Anartik, now a fat salmon, saw his father crying in the umiak. Anartik grabbed the paddle very strongly, which scared his father. And his father said to his daughters, "Anartik nearly pulled my paddle from my hand." So when the father put the paddle in again, Anartik again swam up to the umiak, held the paddle so strongly that when his father tried to lift the paddle out of the water, he brought his salmon son up with it. And then Anartik became a man again, and he hunted for many, many years to feed his family. And so this is how the story goes of Anartik, the son who became a salmon spirit. Trust the process. And I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Runa Das, and she'll present her opening statement.
Okay, there we go. I'm unmuted now. Thanks so much, Lynn. I'm so happy to be here today. And first, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Kusupsum and Lekwungen peoples, and I'm very grateful for that. And also, I want to quickly make a quick note that I'm not associate professor, but I'm assistant professor in the College of Interdisciplinary Studies. I think we're at a really critical juncture when it comes to the environment, environmental education, environmental ethics. And I think it's very clear the impacts of climate change. I do think, we've been at this critical juncture for quite some time, but I think it's very hard now to deny what's happening to the environment, to the environments we live in, work in, play in, and ultimately the environments that sustain life on Earth. And this point we're at presents an opportunity. It presents an opportunity to carve out pathways for going forward. And we do need to carve out these pathways, because as we are currently standing, things are not sustainable. And I do believe that these pathways present an opportunity to correct for previous wrongdoings and previous injustices, so that we can go forward thinking about social justice, environmental justice, energy justice. I think these are all connected concepts when we're talking about ethics in this sphere. And I will pass it over to Gio.
I think Pedro was supposed to go next, so I will defer to him, Runa.
Thank you. Oh, Lynn and Runa, thank you so much for your initial thoughts. I don't have a story, but I think that my thoughts can connect quite well with your own. Lynn, you through your story, you speak very eloquently about equity for all aspects of the environment, the interconnection, absolutely. And Runa, you speak about the need for us to carve pathways and take advantage of the opportunity to move away from the critical juncture, recognizing that we are in the middle of a crisis. I agree with you. I'm going to argue two things over the next few minutes. The first one is that it is critical for us to agree that we need to spend less time having a discussion about normative ethics, the aura, what is it that we should do from the right or wrong normative moral perspective, into practical ethics. And we recognize that really this is a matter of action, not paralysis by analysis. And I believe I'm going to be arguing that, according to my belief and passion for the Frankfurt School of Critical Thinking, that education is the best pathway forward. It is the best mechanism to induce, not only through education, research, and academic inquiry, to mobilize, accomplish social justice, and acknowledge that our universities, our teaching and learning process, it is probably the most efficient way into triggering collective action, by recognizing that universities actually do have a special purpose, a social function that needs to concentrate on dealing with the present day crisis. I'll be happy to elaborate later on. Now it's your turn, Gio.
Thank you, Pedro. I'm delighted to be here on the traditional lands of the Kusupsum and Lekwungen families and ancestors, and with the stream team in particular. In fact, after hearing their statements, my work here is done. But I will throw an initial salvo in from a communications perspective. If we see ethics as a set of obligations that we adopt based on our morals or our values, and if we see the environment as natural and human constructed places on Earth, we can approach the question how to address and communicate environmental ethics to make a difference. From a communications perspective, and this finds resonance in what my learned colleagues have already said, it's important to understand and identify what's really going on in the public sphere. So this is, again, a critical framework. The values at work behind all of our words and our silence, our actions and our inactions in relation to the environment. Scholars offer different ways to understand the ideological roots of environmental ethics, and typically they put them on a binary, or better yet, on a spectrum. For example, anthropocentric versus ecocentric, or social institutions based on domination or partnership or partnerism, present versus future interests, and so on. But while helping us to understand different perspectives, classifying and labeling perspectives often is turned into, in the public sphere, it's turned into a rhetorical attack, setting up opposing poles that paralyze. And these opposites arrest critical thinking and cooperation rather than promoting dialogue and solutions through communication. Just as there's no single answer to our complex and emergency complex and urgent environmental crisis. Some duplications there, but no one code of ethics, I believe, can present us with the only right way to re-envision and begin to rebuild, begin to improve the relationship that humans have with the Earth. But drawing on Royal Roads' core values, care, creativity, and courage, and informed by perspectives shared by Indigenous thinkers and authors, I suggest an approach rooted in relationality, mutuality, and locality. And what does that mean for communicating environmental ethics to make a difference? In my last sentence, it means disrupting the old story, sharing new visions, centering environmentalism and environmental justice, one event, one classroom, one conversation at a time. So those are our 4 opening statements. We now proceed to the unscripted part of the program, where we're just going to throw it open, the 4 of us, and have a spontaneous conversation around what we've heard and what we've said, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end and engage in a broader conversation. So I'm going to throw it over to you, colleagues, to start taking this wherever you wish.
If it's okay, colleagues, I'm happy to take the first stab at it. By following up on my opening statement, I really believe that while it is important for us to understand from the normative perspective what is right and what is wrong, and what is that we ought to do, I am frequently concerned that we suffer in academia of what is referred to as paralysis by analysis, too much discussion. And it is the Frankfurt School postmodern thinkers that have told us, if we are in a position to spend time thinking, learning, sharing with others and from others, it is truly a waste and a sad resource, a waste of resources, if we believe that a conference is enough, a conversation is enough, or spending a year doing research, writing a paper that ends up in a bookshelf collecting dust is enough. I believe that the challenges of present-day society demand from us to take action. That's why I believe that the emphasis on practical ethics is what deserves our attention. The conversation on the arguments that frame our understanding of the environment and our role in protecting the environment is beyond just the intellectual exercise, is more of a survival exercise. And from that view, I think we need to recognize that we are dealing with a complex systems approach that require joint collaboration. It starts with initial individual step and reflection, but collective action. So because we need to understand that the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the social injustices are actually linked. They are intertwined. They're not independent challenges that deserve independent attention, they deserve an understanding of their interconnection. And that the challenges that we have in front of us is not just how to prevent, but it's actually how to address the problem and fix it. So the challenge is major in front of us, and remain to keep our efforts on the reflection and discussion, I think is not enough. It is really to move forward into action. Finally, I do believe that universities have a social responsibility. They are uniquely positioned to not only host spaces for positive and respectful dialogue, debate, and thinking, but it is a responsibility to take concrete action through the power of teaching, learning, and research, through the power of collective thinking, and their ability to trigger individual self-reflection and collective action to be more strategic in their commitment and their ability to organize action. At Royal Roads, I'm very proud of what we've done. I think our clear commitment with change making, truth and reconciliation, EDI, and of course, climate change, particularly what we've done over the last 3 or 4 years, is of great satisfaction, but is nothing if nothing comes out of them. So it is the commitment about what will come, not what has happened, what will justify our ability to resolve the crisis and actually continue to be proud members of a unique special purpose university. Pass it back to you, G.
Well, okay. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to lob this one out to the panel. The notion that I think Einstein or somebody like him famously said that we can't solve new problems with old ways of thinking, the ways of thinking that created them to begin with. So what we're really talking about is a radical re-envisioning of the way we go about things. And that means questioning some fundamental assumptions. And one of them is the so-called Western approach to knowledge, which actually resent that any quadrant of the compass can be discursively monopolized in that way. But that's a whole other discussion that I'll leave to my students. But the notion that to understand the world, we have to deconstruct it, put it under a microscope, and most importantly, sever it from the other parts. And that, I think, works diametrically opposite to the holistic approach that's needed. For example, when you entwine, as all three of my learned colleagues have said, issues of social and environmental justice, how do you separate them into committees? You can as a means of understanding them, but somehow you have to coordinate it. So last comment, radicalism. The word radical gets a bad rap by the people well served by business as usual, but really the Latin root of it is exactly that. It's the root of something. So we are challenging the root of the way that the society and our academic institutions with it in their approach to knowledge are being run. That's my attempt at a provocation.
I just want to jump in here. I've got a couple thoughts. First, Pedro, I very much agree. I think we need to be practical with how we move forward with this kind of stuff, because then we will see it manifest, I think, more so. And getting stuck on analysis, that might slow us down, right? And we just don't want to keep spinning the wheel here. I think we do want to see action. But I do want to point out that I think, thinking about something as good or not good, I don't think we can move away from that necessarily. I do think we need to think about what is right and what is wrong. Inequity is not good. Equity is good. So I think we do need to come at this with some kind of moral compass guiding, these pathways and these actions. And also, Gio, your thoughts on radicalism, I very much agree with how this word can get, pejorative, but I think we are seeing some of these calls to action as radical democracy movements, right, from youth. So there is this call to action that's coming from lots of different groups and actors lots of youth engagement, and I think it is radical, and I think that's important. Voices get heard, and I think right now is a time and a place for that voice, to come out and to be heard. So that's all I kind of wanted to mention. Both of your thoughts made me think about this. So
thank you, Dr. Doss. I just want to put in here that I mean, we're sort of narrowing our conversation in terms of possible solutions, or we're saying that we have all of these issues. And just very recently, this is the beauty of being a master's student, I'm learning every day new things. So I have been introduced to Cree ethicist Willie Ermine and his work in the ethics of engagement. And in it, he talks about how, just like Dr. Doss is saying, how we may not be able to get rid of the binaries. They do exist. But he talks about how each of these groups of people, in his context, he's speaking about Western law systems and Indigenous communities, but about how they each have their place, that there is not necessarily a right or wrong, and that it is an art of bringing these conversations together in order to move forward. And so I think in terms of ethics, it presents something that's interesting, where we aren't trying to narrow anything. We aren't trying to expand anything. We are accepting each of these groups as they are and working together. So as communicators, as academic institutions, energy producers, all of these aspects of society, it's not necessarily a matter of trying to forget what we are, who we are, but instead, how do we bring those together in order to move forward?
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate very much comments and Lynn, good news. Life is all about learning beyond academic credentials. So if you like learning, if you have learned how to learn and you have loved how to learn, I have nothing but good news for you. At the same time, I want to, in the most humble form, to say that academic credentials are the vehicle, but the credentials themselves do not make us better person or smarter person. They just acknowledge that we've gone through a process, but the outcome of that process is really individual. And Runa, I think we're saying the same thing. Absolutely, the moral compass is critical. Really, my point, and I don't think it got missed. It's about going beyond that. It is going beyond the simple conversation about the normatives of the ethics of the subject matter. Coming back to you, Lynn. You started I love the way you started the session with a story. I think that is one of the pathways that we need to explore. And it is a critical fundamental element of the Indigenous way of learning and how knowledge has been transferred from generations. The oral approach to communications with a clear emphasis on what the core message is, but letting the listener make sense of the message, make it in his own or her own. I think that might be one of the tools that we might want to learn how to better leverage and take advantage of, how to use properly in a constructive way in order to trigger the action that we want. I celebrate this choice of starting with a story. I'm learning from you. Thank you.
There is support for that ancient notion. Even the communications literature has managed to start to catch up with something called the narrative paradigm theory that posits that our essential way, our primeval way to communicate is through stories and storytelling, and that part of the practical applied ethics that Pedro mentioned earlier is enacting and embodying those ethics in the stories that we tell. I mentioned at the end of my opening salvo, one event, one class, one conversation at a time. So yes, we do need a systemic United Nations type of effort, and good luck with that on many fronts that we can look at. the daily news and draw from. But we also need to do it within our respective spheres of influence. And that's certainly where the literature is also pointing us to consider it a, I won't say battle, I'll say calling, ground level, grassroots level calling, those kinds of conversations, right? When you're speaking with people, how does this affect, whether it's an issue of clean air or clean water in a community, for example, you can ask people, how would the lack of that impact your community? Can you envision that, or envision your community with your kids being able to enjoy these things that that they might necessarily not if we don't do measure X, Y, and Z.
If you don't mind me again learning from Lynn, sharing a more of a personal very short story. When I discovered that my heart was in education as a tool for social transformation, I went to my father and my grandfather in my culture, very important figures, and I told them that I want to be a university professor, a profession that sadly in some regions around the world, like the area where I come from, is seen as a second-class job. When I told him that I want to be a university professor, I remember my dad grabbing his chin, scratching his head and saying, great for you. I'm happy you have that clarity, but just be aware that, and I hopefully by quoting my dad, I'm not offending anyone. I don't think that was his intention, but he said, just be aware that if what you want is to trigger and be part of change, probably the two most conservative institutions in human history, and by that he meant institutions that change very little or very slowly, are the Catholic Church and universities. And I think that point wasn't lost in me. Nonetheless, believing that there is a lot of truth in what my father said at that point 35 years ago, I believe that it requires a special place like Royal Roads University, with a particular culture and specific mandate, and a high sense of comfort with social change and uniqueness and try new things. A place that to really break a little bit of that previous rule of our understanding. We're lucky to be in the geographical position that we are, with the community that we have, and students that are driven by learning, not just by the credential. At the average age of our students, last time that I looked at the report, is 40 and a half years old. Those students are not here because they want a new job. They're here because they're driven by the learning, by the personal development. And they're fortunately in a position where they can start making meaningful decisions, personal and professional, rather than at 20, where the individual would have to continue the process of personal maturity and wait a few years before being in a position of authority and decision making. So let's leverage that. Let's leverage the place, the time, and the location of our learning community. I hope that helps.
I'd like to quickly comment on storytelling as a form of communication and ethics. And I think it's very, very powerful, especially when we're talking about something like morals and rights and wrongs. I think telling people what is right and wrong is not the way to necessarily go about this in terms of communication and in terms of knowledge and relaying knowledge to others. I think storytelling invokes a different type of knowledge that is connected to feeling, and we learn through our feelings what then is good or what is wrong, or we can connect to those kinds of concepts through our emotions. And I think I'm so happy that you started this session with a story, because I think it is such a powerful way to communicate ethics. So thank you so much.
Environmentalists have had that problem and in environmental communication, right, for a generation, since the first Earth Day in 1970. It's been, if only we could communicate the science, if only we could make people understand it. And consequently, environmentalists are not held in the highest of regard and paid the most attention to, simply exactly because, Runa, they're doing what you said we shouldn't do, right? They're projecting a holier than thou attitude of I know better than you do, and that's problematic in the kind of context we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm in agreement here. I know that I think we want to open up to questions here pretty soon because we're 15 minutes to the end. Sorry, the facilitator in me is monitoring the time. But I just wanted to say that this is really bringing forward to me as a communicator and the role of communications in ethics, that we do have an opportunity as communicators to build that ethical space, to help create that narrative that will bring forward conversations and ultimately bring us together through different communication channels. And I think some of Ermine's work also touches on that, but I just wanted to put that in there, that as communicators, we do have an opportunity to facilitate that ethical space. And personally, that's something that I'm pondering a lot, especially recently. But I don't know, Gio, do we want to open it up to questions? Or Kennedy, are you willing to moderate? Or
yes, if you guys are would like to move on to some questions from the chat, I can definitely do that. I can find those and bring them up for you. Unless there's any other comments from our speakers. We're good? Okay. First question that we had in the chat here is from Kelly. And she put, your point about elevating the importance of the relationship humans have with the earth really resonates. How do you think UNDRIP can be helpful in this relationship rebuilding process? Do you think UNDRIP can help drive that change?
I can throw an opening salvo to that. I did respond. Yes, emphatically. Yeah, UNDRIP presents a wonderful opportunity to get in at the ground level and start building up, because it in foregrounding and in drawing the world, the entire world community's attention to Indigenous rights. It's pointing to the fact that the current system is broken, and that a fair or ethical, and this is going to what Runa was talking about, model needs to supplant it. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity and a responsibility, a statement of responsibility for what we have to do, we as a global community.
Thank you, Gio.
UNDRIP being UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, for in case some of you didn't know.
Thank you for expanding on that. Another question is from Marie, and it says storytelling, education, crisis communication, science communication, each with a different set of ethical focus and values. How can the practitioner sort through all of this and put it into practice?
Let me try, and hopefully I'm providing value to the question. In a way, it's how to sort out the different challenges to get us moving forward. I think that the first principle is, let's not try to fix everything before we move forward. If we try that, we're not going to get progress. Let's start moving forward by, first of all, indicating our personal commitment with others, triggering conversation and inviting others to joining forces, working together, speaking and spreading the word. I think that's incredibly powerful. Having said that, a minute ago, I expressed my enthusiasm by the fact that railroads can accomplish significant change, rapid change, by the fact that our students are mid-career managers at 40 years old in average. Yes, I believe that is true, and we're lucky about that. But after I said it, I realized that that could have sounded as a criticism to younger individuals of our society, and could suggest that could imply that they are less interested and motivated to actually make a difference. I'd like to correct that. As a matter of fact, I have two members of my family, my daughter, my son are 26 and 24. I have to say that I am super impressed when I'm able to join them on conversations about socially relevant topics. I'm impressed that they are way ahead of what I was at their ages, and that they take a much more mature, pragmatic approach to the challenges, frequently expressing their frustration at the lack of action by the previous generation. I do believe that I believe that my generation was different from my father's, and my father's is very different from his father's. I'm using that expression just as an expression of generational change. I believe that the changes are even more meaningful between my own children and mine. And I believe that we are in good hands. We just need to empower them, join them, celebrate them, and if possible, allocate the resources that they might not have in order to be part of this important project. So this is my way of saying, let's bring them in, not disqualify them simply by the fact that they're younger. That would be a major mistake. If that's what I implied before, I apologize for that. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add, Pedro, to that, I mean, I keep going back to the ethical space concept, but Marie, when I think about your question, I think about that ethical space because it really allows for, or having communicators to have a focus of creating ethical space, because it allows for intergenerational collaboration, which is something that I think Pedro is alluding to in that we all work together, and as communicators, if we have an opportunity to do it intergenerationally, intersectionally, we tend to silo ourselves out in communications and other fields. I'm sure I'm not aware of them, but really thinking about that intergenerational, intersectional collaboration and in having an intention of creating ethical space for all of these voices. How you do that, I don't have any answers yet, but that's another discussion.
Runa, did you have some thoughts on the intergenerational, what you're seeing among shifting environmental attitudes?
I keep doing that. Apologies. It's a habit, I guess. I think we are seeing a lot of interest, a lot of involvement, a lot of call to action from youth, and for them, it's high priority: environmental ethics and education and the climate. It appears to be something that concerns them, on a day-to-day kind of basis. It's front and center, and I think this is great. I think this is wonderful, and I think we can learn from them, and hopefully, we can learn from each other. But I definitely do see there a rise in interest. And I think it's because of the state of, the world. I think it's imperative. I feel that they feel it's imperative. And so hopefully we can be there for them and support them as they try and navigate this space, which is why the communication and the study of ethics in the environment is so critical right now.
It's a big shakeup we're talking about, right? I agree. We're coming off, at least in our materially at least, very wealthy society generally. There are, of course, some flagrant, notorious, large exceptions to that. But we're coming off a generation, the history's largest recorded demographic bulge, the baby boomers, which has been very catered to in a consumerist, materialist society. And it has fueled, especially in the 1980s, a decade where a lot of my opinions were formed. It's fueled a lack of humility And I think that to answer Gordon's, or begin to answer Gordon's wonderful question in the chat box, coming to an ethic modeled more on humility and mutuality than individual aggrandizement would be a great place to start. So would finding words with fewer syllables than aggrandizement, I think.
I also want to quickly add to that, Gio, that made me think about anecdotally my own parents and how my parents are now learning from my sister's kids in terms of thinking about the environment and thinking about climate. And so we definitely can learn from each other, and there can be a shift generationally, from the older generation, which is fantastic. So it's wonderful. We can all really learn from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Like great comments from everyone. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left, so maybe time for one more question. If that's all right with you guys. Let me see here from the chat. Okay, a question from Chase. As someone interested in images, how do you think environmental justice and sustainability can be communicated visually, especially since some studies suggest that there are feelings of anxiety when we are faced with images of melting icebergs or emaciated polar bears? Interesting question.
I can start with some clues from the aforesaid literature, which calls on us to evoke and invoke positive images of the future that we want to counter the devastation of the images that our learned colleague mentioned. Right, to that part of the communication effort here should be to overcome, I think, the greatest obstacle to change, or one of them, and that's the fear of change and the fear of the unknown. So we visualize the alternative and present a visual narrative of the way things can be and already are in some respects, but could certainly be on a larger scale. Again, fueled by the positive, if I may use that term, maybe the ethics that Runa mentioned earlier.
For me, Chase, this is totally subjective, this comment, but I think it's obviously it's our role as communicators to be sharing all kinds of images, and I think that it's okay if people have the response of anxiety. Like Runa had mentioned before, we learn from our emotions. And so this is where a collaborative approach can come in. Maybe there are other disciplines that could support us in communications, in helping people, because they are facing those feelings of anxiety when they see images, or when they hear news, or they have emotional reactions. And I'm not sure the emotional reactions are necessarily a bad thing and that we can avoid them. It's a matter of how can we work together in supporting people as communicators through those emotions, knowing we have a limited scope of what we can do, but in collaboration, are there other ways?
Yeah, my 2 cents, being humble and acknowledging that out of the colleagues I'm with today, I am definitely not the communications expert, but so my thought is quite simple. Apologies for that. I do believe in the great power of images. Someone said images are worth 1,000 words. I do believe in them. Nonetheless, as Lynn said, they are limited. Images make sense when they come with meaning, and that meaning is incredibly subjective, and that subjectivity is incredibly limited by interculturality. The same image might actually mean very different things for people from different regions around the world. Myself, coming from Latin America, I can tell you that the image of the lonely polar bear, it is powerful, but it triggers less action is a part of the world that is very far away and we know nothing about, and we don't understand the dynamics. Maybe polar bears should be alone. Who knows? So I think that requires a more complex strategy with greater awareness of interculturality and what are the common messages that we could convey through images to our larger audiences. It's a technical problem, but I think that we can resolve that. Thank you.
Thank you everyone so much for answering the questions and for your amazing discussion. We have to end the session right now and go into a 15-minute break. And the next session is at 12 Pacific Standard Time, and it is indigenizing professional communication. And as mentioned in the chat, it will not be recorded, so be sure to turn in live. And thank you everyone for joining.